Hey there, thank you for tuning into Duckbricks, and welcome to the final episode of Bionicle Retold, the show where I told the entire Bionicle storyline from the beginning to the end. Now this has been a great last few months, and every 2 weeks I've been posting a new episode of Bionicle Retold, starting things off with the prologue, which covered the Core War, and going all the way up to the episode that was released 2 weeks ago, Chapter 9, Rebirth. And now we have reached the end. This is the final full-on episode of Bionicle Retold, and I do hope you enjoy. Now let's get started off with a recap of Chapter 9, Rebirth.
Reign of Shadows! In a climactic final battle above and below Metru Nui, the Toahaga, Makuta Miserix, and leading members of the Order of Matanui were soundly defeated. In a cunning plot to seize control of the entire Matoran universe, the spirit of the Dark Lord Makuta Pterodax overthrew the Matanui consciousness, assuming control over the colossal Great Spirit robot and casting the mask of life deep within the void of space. As Matanui discovered the desert world of Bara Magna and fought alongside Latorian warriors in a quest to return home, the Matoran universe was plunged into darkness. With warriors like Vezon, Mazika, and Voltraz plunging through alternate universes in a desperate attempt to get home, all eyes are on the Toa Nuva, Toa Mari, remaining members of the Order of Matanui, and even the Dark Hunters, as they lead an ill-fated rebellion against the Makuta from within, desperately struggling to fight back against the god of their world. This is Bionicle Retold. Chapter 10, Destiny. Part 1, Reign of Shadows. On the desert planet of Bara Magna, the Kanohi Ignika, Mask of Life, crash-landed in the barren wasteland, forming bonds of friendship with the Glatorian warriors and battling to find a path back to the Matoran universe and rescue his people. As Toa Matanui ventured across this hostile realm, we return to the planet Aqua Magna, where the Great Spirit robot stands tall for the first time in 100,000 years. With Makuta Pterodax established as Dark Lord of the universe, thus began a period of endless suffering. On the island fortress of Doxia, headquarters of the Order of Matanui, armies of Rakshi made landfall, sweeping across the fortified cities and decimating most Order agents left to guard the main base. As precious few veteran agents like Trinuma fled the massacre, the Paraka vanished from their water tank prison, and the Dark Hunter Dweller, confined deep within the darkest dungeons of the Order stronghold, fled his captivity in the chaos. The only remaining pool of energized protodermis in existence was held deep within Daxia, and quickly claimed by Pterodax. The few members of the Brotherhood of Makuta who remained alive were enslaved by Pterodax, forced to endlessly churn out new Rakshi before being swiftly eliminated, leaving Pterodax the only Makuta left alive, save for the enslaved Makuta Miserix, who was stuck in the illusion of a painting for Pterodax's amusement. In the aftermath, Makuta used his newfound godlike powers to recreate the Visorak race, undoing the efforts of the Toa Nuva and Toa Mari to wipe out the Scourge from the universe, and commanding the vicious spiders to sweep across the land in his name. In the vast city of Metru Nui, the majority of the Matoran population were enslaved by armies of Rakshi, with Matoran workers slaughtered en masse until the populace finally gave in, keeping the forges running to operate the mind and body of the Great Spirit robot. The Turaga were subsequently imprisoned, with the devious Matoran Akmal placed in charge of city operations. What Matoran could escape sought refuge in the darkness of the archives, locating the shape-shifting Rahi Kraka, who agreed to protect the city's remaining population. And deep within these archives, the surviving Toa teams, agents of the Order, and the Dark Hunters convened, planting the seeds to a larger rebellion against the Makuta. As Rakshi roamed the empty streets of Metru Nui, killing or imprisoning all who ventured out, plans were made and speeches were given deep underground, with the Toa Nuva and Taka Nuva taking the lead as the powerful figureheads of the rebellion. Realizing they would be a bigger target if they stayed together, the Toa decided to split up, each covering different pockets of the Matoran universe to establish a secret communication network and intelligence system across the universe. Journeying to the ruins of the Makuta fortress on Destro, Takanuva and Pohatu hid in the darkness, scavenging through ancient artifacts and weapons to get an edge on Rakshi enforcers. Uncovering the colossal teleportation engine, Takanuva quickly summoned Toa Nuparu for his engineering skills to repair the engine, and Nuparu began the monumental task of reverse engineering the ancient and powerful artifact. Discovering the remains of the massacre on Daxia, Tahu rushed to convene with Gali and warn the others of the Rakshi army movements, who in turn was deep in research on the Great Beings, hoping to find a weakness to cripple the Great Spirit Robot and Makuta Spirit from within. All these years, the Toa Nuva had strived to reawaken the Great Spirit Robot, and now all their trials had led to this cruel, ironic final mission, destroying the robot which they had fought so desperately to awaken from within. As months passed under Pterodax's reign, the Toa Nuva rallied the resistance effort and embarked on their own missions, forming ragtag teams with former enemies and dark hunters to cripple Makuta's new form. As Tahu correctly assumed, it took Pterodax time and practice to master the complexities of the Matoran universe and acclimate to his new form, and the resistance effort used that precious time to their advantage. In the ruins of the deserted realm of Karzani, Tahu led a strike force consisting of the Dark Hunter Guardian, Ancient Keeper of Secrets, the shape-shifting female Rahi Kraka, Jomak, agent of the Order of Matanui with the Atom Reconstruction power, and Lariska, former member of the Federation of Fear and Dark Hunter Assassin. Alongside them was the new chronicler, Kopik, who once aided Takua years ago on the island of Matanui as part of the Chronicler's company. Their mission was to meet up with Onua, who had led his own team of Order of Matanui agents to seize a weapons cache to the south of the realm, and rendezvous in the middle of the Forsaken Land. As the team discussed strategies and reassured Kopik's fears, Guardian left the campsite, wondering if there was a way off the universe, and if their fight against the god of their world was truly a lost cause. In an instant, beneath his feet, the ground opened. Bonds made of solid stone wrapped around him, yanking him down into the hole even as he screamed. Then, the barren earth slammed shut again, and he was gone. Just like that, one of the oldest and most experienced Dark Hunters was killed in an instant, fused to the ground itself and crushed under tons of rock and soil. Leaping to their feet, Tahu and his team came to a terrifying realization. Makuta Pterodax had begun to master the ability to pinpoint the locations of individual beings in the universe, and was simply leaving Tahu and the rest of his team alive to toy with them. Sounds of metallic footsteps filled the air, and to their horror, Tahu's team was immediately surrounded by dozens of Exo-Toa sentries, missiles loaded and aimed at the fugitives. As the robotic shelves spoke in the hollow voice of Makuta Pterodax, threatening to enslave or kill the dissidents, Tahu suppressed his impulse to leap into action and go down fighting. Learning from his past and drawing from his experience, Tahu kept a level head and stayed calm, preventing needless violence and bloodshed. As the team prepared to surrender and stage a future escape, the ground began to shake beneath them, and erupting from the catacombs below Karzani was Toa Onua, who instantly generated a vast pit underneath the Exo-Toa, temporarily delaying them. As he caught up with Tahu, Onua explained how Rakshi had killed the remaining Order agents, seizing the weapons cache and preventing Onua from claiming the supplies. As Lariska began to brainstorm a new mission, Onua came up with a deadly plan. Makuta Pterodax was clearly not fully in control of his new power, and needed Rakshi and Exo-Toa to act as his eyes and ears on the ground. While Pterodax was all-powerful, there was still only one way to make new Rakshi, by transforming Krata with energized protodermis. And so, to stop the steady flow of new Rakshi, they had to complete the mission the Order of Matanui began in the early stages of the Destiny War, destroy the final source of energized protodermis in the heart of the former Order fortress on Daxia, now heavily guarded by the most powerful agents of Makuta. Back in Metru Nui, smoke billowed as an army of heat vision Rakshi raced to Po Metru to pacify the Matoran workers, led by the Skakti warlord Nektan, who had sided with Pterodax against the will of his fellow Skakti warlords. Desperately defending their home and blasting through the Rakshi ranks, the Toa Mari defended Po Metru and the entrance to the archives, where many of the other Matoran had sought refuge. As Tahu, Onua, and the rest of their team embarked on the long journey to Daxia, the rest of the Toa were embroiled in their own personal missions. With Gali still studying the great beings, the Toa Mari defending the archives while attempting to break the Toa Haga out of their trance, and Kopaka on a quest of his own, that left Liwa on a simple mission: venture to the island of Artaka and convince the ancient ruler of that sanctum to join the fight against Makuta. But as he came within sight of the island, he could tell it was already too late. Shattered Rakshi littered the coastline, but more still were advancing on the fortress. Artaka's Matoran workers were fighting a desperate defense, but it was a lost cause. Just as Liwa prepared to jump into action, the voice of the Titan Artaka echoed through his head. Proclaiming the island and himself as a lost cause, Artaka teleported Liwa to a mysterious cave, bidding him to seek the aid of another ancient being should Artaka fail. And so, Liwa found himself face to face with a writhing mass of tentacles, bones, and eyes. The old god, Tren Kral. Meanwhile, on the Skakti island of Zakaz, the 5 Toamari assembled with a new mission. Weeks ago, they had defended the archives against the Skakti warlord Nektan and his Rakshi invasion, who had allied himself with Makuta Pterodax. Now, Nektan led his armies of barbarians south for purposes unknown. Having failed to free the Toahaga from their trance or reconstruct the Destral teleportation engine, the Toamari had been sent by Tahu to gather information on the remaining Skakti warlords and potentially recruit some of the savage warmongers to their cause. On top of that, there was a mystery to be solved. Following the widespread destruction on Doxia, the sea snakes that were once the evil Paraka had vanished. It had been believed they were just buried in the rubble, but rumors were flying that they had been rescued and spirited away to Zakaz. For what purpose, no one could say. Quickly suffocating the Skakti guards on the shore, Kongu took the lead, and the 5 Toa ventured inland, with Huki using his powers of stone to distract the Skakti patrols long enough for Holly to use her elemental power of water to detect an underground river leading straight to the largest Skakti stronghold. As the amphibious Toamari dived deep beneath the water once again, they came upon a massive sanctum, where a Skakti warlord was delivering a rousing speech to a gathering of nearly 500 barbarians. As rallying cries punctuated a grand speech declaring their intent to rise up against Makuta Pterodax himself while the Toa, Dark Hunters, and Order hid in the darkness, a massive tank rose from beneath the ground, bubbling with energized protodermis. Before the Toamari had a chance to even process the fact that the Skakti had somehow obtained more of the substance, their attention was drawn to a group of prisoners being led to the pool. A savage Zyglak, a defeated and battered Vortex, a brutish Steltian laborer, and 5 of the Paraka, still writhing and gasping in their sea snake forms. Horrified, the Toamari came to a realization. The Skakti would have had no idea which specific beings to throw in the bubbling pool unless the idea was planted in their heads by the god in control of destiny, Makuta Pterodax. At the warlord signal, the 3 prisoners and the 5 Paraka were thrown into the energized protodermis tank. So engrossed were the Skakti that they failed to notice a strange, greenish cloud of antidermis emerge from a nearby lake, hover in the air for a moment, and then plunge into the energized protodermis tank. As the liquid began to froth and bubble, the Toamari could see a shape forming in the silver fluid, something monstrous and horrible. As they watched in shock and terror, before their eyes, a new and terrible form of life began to climb from the tank. Elsewhere in the universe, the Baraki Pridax stood on a pedestal before his assembled legions of warriors and outcasts. He, Kalma, and Mentax had rebuilt their legions, while Elec had returned to the sea to gather his own troops. They were poised to strike as soon as the Shadowed One unleashed his viruses on Makuta Pterodax. The universe would be theirs to rule once more. But then there was nothing. The appointed time had come and gone, with only a violent earth tremor to mark it. At first, Pridak thought that the Shadowed One had succeeded, and the quake was a sign he had overthrown Makuta Pterodax. But it became rapidly obvious that nothing had changed. Pterodax was still in control, and now Pridak had a choice. March on Metru Nui and risk destruction at the hands of the Makuta, or stay put and risk rebellion by his legions. Seething with rage at the Shadowed One's apparent failure, Pridak resolved to march on Metru Nui with the rest of the Baraki and their combined legions, rallying the armies to march on Makuta Pterodax's Rakshi, Exotoa, and Vizorak forces in the city. In a chamber on the island of Zia, the stone floor was littered with the shattered remains of precious vials. There was no trace of the Shadowed One, or what once contained the vials of viruses. Every vortex in a wide radius had met a horrible death, pulverized into fragments without a trace. In his attempt to unleash the prototype viruses on Makuta Pterodax, the Shadowed One had inadvertently released a deadly viral agent, barely surviving to flee to other corners of the universe. And on an uncharted island in the southern regions, Axon, one of the final surviving members of the Order of Matanui, had been teleported from the chambers beneath Metru Nui by Makuta Pterodax. Locked in an endless illusion and desperate to find his comrade Brutaka, Axon used his mental powers and Mask of Truth to finally break free of Pterodax's spell, finding himself on an uninhabited beach in the middle of nowhere. He didn't know for certain where he was, nor did he care at the moment. All that mattered to him was where Makuta was, and he knew that answer. Somehow, some way, Axon was going to make it back to Metru Nui, and Makuta was going to pay for what he had done, even if it cost Axon his life. And finally, Toa Helrix, leader of the Order of Matanui, sat alone in her prison, with only the echoing thoughts of Pterodax and a portrait of Makuta Mizrix to keep her company. Knowing the Matoran population could never be convinced to stop working if their comrades and friends were killed as a result, Helrix came to a sickening realization. Defeating Pterodax and demolishing the machinery that ran the Great Spirit robot would spell the eventual death of all beings that lived inside it, the very destruction that Toa Inika, Toa Nuva, and Toa Haga had fought so hard to prevent, and Matoro had sacrificed himself to save. The planet outside had no known landmasses and no place to flee to. The inhabitants of the Matoran universe would suffocate or freeze in the darkness. As leader of the Order of Matanui, Helrix often had to make decisions that sent agents to their deaths. It came with the job. And so, Helrix resolved to stop Pterodax before he killed or enslaved billions of innocents in the universe beyond. Closing her eyes and drawing on all her power, Helrix prepared to unleash a Nova Blast within the mind of Pterodax, preparing to doom the entire Matoran universe to save billions beyond their world. Part 2. Trials of Vezon. As the inhabitants of the Matoran universe faced their greatest battles yet, Vezon, Mazika, and Voltraz tumbled through alternate worlds, cursed by the power of the Olmec now fused to Vezon's face. With the two Matoran enemies cast out to dimensions unknown, Vezon continued ricocheting through the multiverse of madness. One moment, he was out in the sunshine of the Kingdom universe, seeing Matoran and Dark Hunters working together in perfect harmony. The next moment, everything had shifted, and he found himself in a mirror world where an evil Matanui spirit plotted to overthrow the Great Spirit Makuta. His body, his essence, and his mind had fused to that of the Olmec. Wherever he stepped, a new dimensional portal ripped open, and as time passed, Vezon gained more and more mastery over this powerful new ability. In a flash of energy and light, Vezon tumbled toward a portal through the sky, finding himself surrounded by sand in every direction. As he journeyed towards buildings and jungle trees in the distance, Vezon watched as the vast desert gave way to a lush jungle, filled with workers toiling away at constructing vast villages. Some of these workers were Matoran, but others Vezon did not recognize. For these were Agori, and Vezon had found himself in the Spherus Magna alternate universe. Flashing back to thousands of years ago, when the Great Spirit Matanui robot had delved deep into the unknown reaches of space, the Brotherhood of Makuta and Pterodax had chosen not to rebel against Matanui, allowing the colossal robot to fulfill its purpose and return to Bara Magna with the technology to restore the planet to its rightful place, recreating and terraforming the planet of Spherus Magna as it was in the old days. Here, Matoran, Agori, Toa, and Glatorian worked side by side to create a new form of society, rising to prominence among the stars. There, Vezon encountered a variant of Tarduk, who assumed he was a Toa and brought him to the villages of this strange new world. Vezon watched as Toa like Jalar and Kongu worked alongside Glatorian like Gresh and Kina, and most surprising of all, saw that the Brotherhood of Makuta, who in this universe had never revolted, overthrew Tuma and his Skrull legions, taking over command of the black armored warriors to defend the villages. But before Vezon had a chance to comprehend the changes of this world, they were interrupted by a vast army on the horizon. Platoons of Skakti bellowed war cries as Rudaka led her Vortex-kin towards the village, all led by Makuta Mizrix in his dragon form. Bone hunters rushed towards the village, and all around, Toa and Glatorian prepared to defend their villages. As Vezon tried and failed to activate his innate teleportation abilities, the world began to slow and freeze around him. As color faded from the universe and time began to stop, a voice echoed in Vezon's mind. A voice that claimed to be a great being from our core universe. Eons ago, this great being made the error of touching the mask of life. As a result, everything around him, furniture, equipment, even rays of light, came to life. For their own safety, his fellow rulers imprisoned him, and now this cursed great being was perpetually surrounded by living chains, living blocks of stone, and the screams of light as the darkness extinguished it. As Vezon quickly began to understand the plight of the cursed being, an idea came to him. Offer to free the being from his fortress should he return Vezon to the core universe and grant him full dimensional mastery of the Olmec. And with Vezon's fate hanging in the balance, we now shift focus to Mazika and Voltraz, who were cast abruptly from Kara Nui by the power of Vezon's Olmec, and now found themselves hurtling to destinations unknown. Part 3. The Melding Universe. Space. Reality. It's more than a linear path. It's a prism of endless possibilities where one decision, one choice, could change the course of a universe forever. Hundreds of thousands of years ago, the core war for energized protodermis ripped Spherus Magna apart, kickstarting the events of the Legend of Bionicle. But in this universe, the Great Beings created the first Toa far earlier to repair the planet and protect it from the inevitable cataclysm caused by the Shattering. Instead of creating the Great Spirit Matanui robot, the Great Beings refined and perfected the Toa design, granting them the smaller statures of Matoran of our universe, but with greater agility and enhanced elemental and Kanohi powers. The Toa was sent underground, with containers to hold the energized protodermis and the duty of repairing all the planet's damage. And after 5 years, this task, dubbed the Melding, was successfully completed. In the aftermath of the melding, the Great Beings continued to reside in the Valley of the Maze, adding crystal and iron fortifications to the fortress at its center. To create an order of true peacekeepers and servants of the light, the Great Beings brought the Makuta race into being, towering titans with blinding white armor and sworn protectors of the Glatorian, Agori, Toa, and Matoran of this universe, who were much larger Glatorian-sized beings to assist in heavy labor. And with that, we return to Karda Nui, the heart of our core universe. The stage was set for two mortal enemies to collide, hurtling towards each other in a final clash. Just then, there was a sickening moment of darkness and disorientation. In a flash of blinding light, Mazika and Voltraz found themselves plummeting towards the ground, barely escaping a vast lake of energized protodermis as they fell before a massive tree banded with gold metal. In seconds, the two Matoran of Ice and Shadow had been transported to the Melding alternate universe. As the Matoran awoke, dazed from their journey, they were approached by Toamaku and Matoran Helrix, who assumed Mazika and Voltraz were other Toa, given their smaller forms. Mazika and Voltraz soon realized that in this world, Toa were Matoran, and Matoran were Toa, and they would be forced to blend in, lest they draw the attention of the Makuta, heroic protectors of the land. Explaining they were seeking passage home, Mazika and Voltraz were brought before Makuta Pterodax of the Melding universe, who explained his purpose to uphold the values of unity, duty, and destiny, no matter the cost. In this world, a Makuta must be utterly without doubt or fear or any trace of shadow, with years of meditation required to claim the noble title. As they ventured through the Valley of the Maze, Makuta Pterodax saluted Gorast and Icarax, also wearing pristine white armor, and brought them before a vast council chamber illuminated by dim lightstones hanging from the chamber ceiling. As voices began to echo from the dark, and flickering light illuminated the outlines of 6 mysterious figures in the darkness, Makuta Pterodax of the Melding universe introduced Mazika and Voltraz to the Great Beings. Announcing he had used his telepathic abilities to peer inside their souls, Makuta exposed Voltraz as a being filled with darkness, stunning the Great Beings by this flaw in their creation. As the group conversed, the Great Beings explained that they were aware of the multiverse and their counterparts in the vast, uncounted realities that exist. It was only a matter of time until visitors from mirror dimensions pierced the dimensional walls, and to the Great Beings, the chance to dissect and study Voltraz was an alluring opportunity. And so, Mazika was offered an exchange. The Great Beings of the Melding universe would allow him to be returned to his universe, so long as they could keep Voltraz to study him, to understand what went wrong in his creation. In return, they would allow Mazika to choose one being from their universe to go with him to our prime dimension, to keep the balance between realities. While Mazika at first refused, his noble heart unwilling to doom even Voltraz to an eternity in a separate reality, the Great Beings made it clear he had no say in the matter. Makuta Pterodax had seen the rot in his spirit, and peered into a distorted mirror, and fully supported Voltraz's punishment. And as the Shadow Matoran was dragged away by other Makuta, Mazika made his choice. Calling on the white-armored Makuta Pterodax, he made ready to return to the main universe and bring a powerful new ally to turn the tide. Back in our core universe, on the planet of Aqua Magna, Makuta Pterodax, in the huge robotic body that once belonged to Matanui, surveyed the world he stood on. There was nothing but water as far as the eye could see. Despite the waters teeming with life and escape pit prisoners still struggling to survive, to Pterodax, all their struggles were beneath him, and there were worlds out there teeming with life, waiting to be conquered. Pterodax pondered to himself, Why should he be satisfied with ruling a universe inside this body, where he could master a true universe of planets and suns and stars? This robot body had the power to lay waste to cities, to shatter mountains, to subjugate entire planets, and yet Matanui had not used any of it. And so, Pterodax made his decision. Once he had crushed the final remnants of rebellion inside him, he would beckon to the red star above and begin his journey of conquest, starting with tracking down Matanui's spirit in the Mask of Life on Bara Magna and crushing him and all he cared for beneath his feet. But just then, his thoughts were interrupted. Pterodax felt the presence of another Makuta deep within his body, and since the only remaining living Makuta, Miserix, was trapped in the illusion of a painting, this had to be something else, someone else. And there was only one answer. This new Makuta had come from an alternate universe, and Pterodax was about to come face to face with himself. In a blinding flash of light and energy, Mazika and the Makuta Pterodax of the Melding universe materialized in an uninhabited portion of the southern continent. As darkness began to creep over the valley, Mazika was surprised to see the Melding Pterodax drawing light from the region to prepare for battle. For despite the fact that the Makuta of the Melding universe had purged all darkness from their souls, they had total control over light. And what is darkness but the absence of light? And so, walking down the now darkened path, the two allies made their way out of the valley as their quest truly began. Approaching a sacked and demolished village of Ba Matoran, Masters of Gravity, Mazika and the Melding Pterodax discussed the circumstances of the core Pterodax's fall to darkness, and how easy it may have been for the Melding Pterodax to do the same. Their conversation was interrupted when all around them the winds rose. In a moment, they had gone from gentle breeze to screaming maelstrom, so powerful it knocked Mazika off his feet and sent him tumbling towards the edge of a ridge. Landing among the ruins, Mazika's impact shattered the long-dead corpse of a Vizorak into fine black powder. Now that he looked around, he could see the other bodies of Vizorak spiders scattered here and there. The villagers who had lived here had gone down fighting. But then, a voice came from the dead mouths of the Vizorak all around. Pterodax recognized it as his own, but touched with madness and evil. As the heroic Melding Pterodax proclaimed himself as truly stronger than the Pterodax of this world, for overcoming the temptations he could not, the mouths of the Vizorak corpses only laughed, proclaiming a test for the white-armored Makuta. The air crackled with ozone, and then before Mazika and Pterodax's eyes, three figures appeared. Each resembled Takanuva, legendary Toa of Light, but their armor was jet black and shadow energy swirled about their hands. For Pterodax had his own army of beings from alternate universes, and an apocalyptic final battle was nigh. Part 4. The Many Deaths of Toa Tuyet. Thousands of years ago, in the great city of Metru, the deranged serial killer Toa Tuyet sought the power of the Nui Stone, ancient artifact with the ability to absorb Toa energy into the wielder of the stone, transforming them into the ultimate elemental being with colossal strength and power. Seeking to massacre all Makuta, Dark Hunters, and anyone who stood in her way, Tuyet nearly succeeded in her quest, but after being thwarted by the efforts of Toa Likan and Nadiki, she was imprisoned by the order of Matanui by the teleporting titan Botan. Officially, she was brought to the prison of the Pit, where she allegedly lived out the rest of her days in confinement. And in the depths below Mari Nui, Toa Matoro and Makuta Pterodax in the form of Maxilos Robot encountered the dead body of what appeared to be Tuyet, and while Pterodax's attempts to rebuild the Nui Stone with the Staff of Artaka ultimately failed, all in the Matoran universe believed Tuyet to be dead, and she slowly faded from history. But that is only the history you know, for secretly, the Order of Matanui wished to gain the power of the Nui Stone for themselves. Teleporting Tuyet to a pocket dimension where no Toa existed, the Order of Matanui interrogated her for thousands of years, studying the fragments of the Nui Stone embedded in her armor, and managing to extract samples of the powerful artifact safely from her armor. To cover up this research, the Order of Matanui traveled to an alternate dimension, where they found and killed the Toa Tuyet of that world, transporting her corpse back to the Prime Dimension, where she was placed in the pit with false crystal fragments resembling the Nui Stone embedded in her armor. Meanwhile, after 1,500 years passed in her prison, Tuyet managed to sway a prison guard into believing in her vision. Faking an explosion and claiming Tuyet had died in the unforeseen accident, the Order of Matanui agents secretly helped Tuyet escape, equipping her with the technology of that dimension to traverse universes like the power of the Kanohi Olmec. For years and years, Tuyet began a trans-dimensional journey, carving a path through the multiverse and charging the ancient Nui stone along the way. After 2,000 years passed and Tuyet grew more and more powerful, she finally arrived back in our core dimension, materializing in the archives of Metru Nui right at the peak of Pterodax's reign. Meanwhile, in the archives below Metru Nui, Matoran had formed their own resistance movement, aiding the Toa in their missions to relay information and free their comrades whenever possible. Word that Tahu and Onua's mission to destroy the final energized protodermis pool on Doxia had succeeded had spread across the Matoran resistance movement, and Kapira, Ta Matoran, an old member of Takua's chronicler's company on the island of Matanui, rushed to convene with Maku, who now walked with a pronounced limp due to a narrow escape from an automated exo-Toa. Soon, the two Matoran reunited with Hafu, Po Matoran carver and original chronicler's company member who had been put to work by Akmau carving statues of Makuta Pterodax. As the three Matoran, led by Maku, ventured deeper within the archives, Maku revealed the true reason she had brought them together, for she had encountered Toa Tuyet deep beneath the archives, who claimed to be willing to aid the resistance and defeat Pterodax. Skeptical of her powers and strength, Hafu and Kapura questioned Tuyet, who was overjoyed to realize the Matoran had forgotten of her misdeeds thousands of years ago, and her crimes had faded into obscurity following the death of Likan and Nadiki. Revealing the pulsating Nui stone in her fist, Toa Tuyet explained how she was the perfect ally against Makuta, for he truly believed her to be dead for some 2,000 years. While Maku headed back to spread the news among the Resistance Network, Hafu and Kapura agreed to help connect Tuyet with the rest of the rebellion, who in turn had no doubt she could organize and lead a successful rebellion against Pterodax and bring him down. But she had no intention of allowing Matanui to regain control. Thousands of years to gain power and knowledge had led Tuyet to be convinced Matanui was weak and ineffective, and the Matoran universe needed a ruler like her to truly achieve greatness. Part 5. Gods of Old. As Tuyet plotted to overthrow Makuta Pterodax and seize control of the Matoran universe for herself, conflicts and battles broke out all across the robot. The Toamari, still marooned on the island of Zakaz, were witnessing a grotesque being slowly rise from the tank of energized protodermis. The melding universe Makuta Pterodax and Mazika found themselves facing off against alternate versions of Takanuva, completely turned to the dark. Tahu, Onua, and their team had just won a major victory against Pterodax, overwhelming the guards on Daxia in a massive assault and destroying the only source of New Rakshi. In the ruins of Destral, Takanuva and Pohatu worked desperately to gather arms, salvage weapons and armor, and mount a defense against the Makuta from within. The Skakti warlord Nektan readied his forces of Rakshi and Paraka to venture to the southern islands, for reasons unknown. And in these southern islands, Axon, still reeling from his mind prison, reunited with Brutaka, who was now fully merged with Antidermis and levitating above the ground. Together, the two old friends set off on a long journey back to Metru Nui, fighting their way through hordes of Rakshi, Exotoa, and Vizrak as they went. In the silver sea of Protodermis, the Baraki legions, led by Pradak, sailed for Metru Nui, ready for a grand conquest against the Makuta's Rakshi and Exotoa forces. And on the island of Zia, laborers and workers were on high alert, faced with a virus inadvertently unleashed by the Shadowed One, who had vanished mysteriously. Deep to the south, Kitangu sensed the presence of Vizrak once again and resumed his sole quest to wipe out the vicious spiders. And finally, in the mind of the great spirit robot, Toa Helrix, leader of the Order of Matanui, prepared a devastating Nova Blast, ready to sacrifice all life in the Matoran universe to stop Makuta Pterodax. And on an uncharted island, Toa Liwa found himself face to face with the horrific sight of the slimy, tentacled mass of Tren Krom, former overseer of the Matoran universe now left to rot in his prison cave. A voice, dripping with decay, telepathically wormed its way into Liwa's mind. Explaining that he too had heard the voice of Makuta Pterodax echo through the universe, Tren Krom pondered that there may be a way to use his knowledge of the inner workings of the Matoran universe against Makuta Pterodax, but it would require great sacrifice from Liwa. As the Toa Nuva of Air agreed to do whatever it takes, a tentacle wrapped around his neck, and in the next instant, the world began to spin. There was light and pain and impenetrable darkness, and when the shadows cleared away, Liwa found himself staring at himself. He looked down, only for a microsecond, long enough to see a huge tentacled mass grafted to stone. Instinctively, Liwa realized he was in Tren Krom's body, and Tren Krom's mind was inside his old body. Overjoyed at his newfound freedom, Trencrom, possessing the body of Liwa, only laughed, explaining that in return for his help in overthrowing Pterodax, he would take Liwa's former body as his own, leaving the mind and spirit of the Toa Nuva of Air trapped in Trencrom's body, condemned to the Forsaken Island. As Liwa yelled and protested, straining against the cave, Trencrom took off in his body, telepathically contacting Artaka, who was forced to teleport the body of Liwa to Metru Nui to save the universe and allow Trencrom to join the fight against Pterodax. And so, the world around Trencrom began to shimmer and fade. When his vision was clear again, he was standing in a subterranean tunnel filled with a collection of broken equipment and dust-covered artifacts. He had never physically been to this place before, but he knew what it was: the Metru Nui Archives. As he surveyed his new surroundings, the parting words of Artaka echoed through his mind. Carry out his end of the bargain, or Artaka would find a way to utterly destroy Liwa's body rather than allow Trencrom to steal it for all eternity. As Trencrom and the body of Liwa surveyed his surroundings, he was hailed by Hafu and Kapura, who had brought along Toa Tuyet in the hopes of her turning the tide of rebellion. Reading her mind in mere seconds, Trencrom was amused at her ambitions to overthrow Pterodax, and while she was powerful and dangerous, he surmised that she may have some use as well. Sensing this intrusion into her mind, Tuyet quickly deduced that Liwa was not who he claimed to be, but kept that knowledge to herself. And while Kapura was overjoyed to see a second Toa materialize before him, Hafu began to grow suspicious of both warriors, who seemed to each harbor ulterior motives to aid their cause. Leaving the archives, Trencrom, Tuyet, and the two Matoran came across Toa Pooks and Bomanga, still casually strolling through the city, stuck in their illusion. Intrigued, Trencrom touched the minds of the two Toahaga. A fraction of his mental power tore Makuta's artificial reality to bits. Pooks and Bomanga shook their heads, as if waking from a dream. Even as he restored them to the real world, Trencrom sent his power cascading to the minds of the other Toahaga, freeing them as well. As the Toahaga reeled from the illusion, finally breaking free from their prison at last, Tuyet, Trencrom, and the Matoran ventured onwards, demolishing the wall to Toa Helrix's prison just as she was about to unleash a devastating Nova Blast. Quickly recognizing the Dark Toa, Helrix powered down her Nova Blast and moved to confront Tuyet. But in the commotion, Trencrom was distracted by the portrait of Makuta Mizrix on the wall. The portrait of Mizrix warped, as if folding in on itself. An instant later, Makuta Mizrix himself stood in the chamber, in full reptilian glory. The Makuta looked dazed at first, then his eyes filled with rage. Quickly catching up on the situation, Helrix ordered Hafu and Kapura to leave that sanctum and get word to the rest of the resistance, and be prepared to make peace with the Great Spirit and with each other, for the end of everything was nigh. Just then, Trencrom leapt to a hidden wall of machinery, manipulating a set of controls for the Great Spirit robot. As he muttered about golden armor and sending a beacon to the Agnika, Helrix rushed to stop him, resigned to her decision to destroy the mind of Pterodax, and in turn doom the Matoran universe to destruction. Before either side could complete their tasks, a voice echoed from the chamber wall. Axon and Brutaka had finally returned to Metru Nui. To Axon's surprise, Brutaka declared that Trencrom must be allowed to complete the task he set out to do, and in response, Helrix demanded that the universe must die, and Pterodax with it. Before the startled eyes of Kapura and Hafu, battle lines were drawn. On one side stood Helrix, Mizrix, and Axon, all three determined to demolish the brain of the robot and commit the ultimate sacrifice to kill Pterodax once and for all. On the other stood Tuyet, Trencrom, and Brutaka, who were convinced the Matoran universe could be salvaged, all for their own goals. Helrix avoided Tuyet's slashing attack and landed a sidekick in her midsection. The corrupt Toa of Water staggered backwards, only narrowly avoiding being accidentally struck by Brutaka. The battle had begun only moments before, but already the chamber in which they fought was in shambles. Mizrix thought he would have the easiest opponent. He could sense that Liwa Nuva was not himself, but under the control of another. Whoever that was, they had no access to the Toa's air power, which he thought would make him ripe for defeat. Unfortunately for him, Liwa's body was now home to Trencrom, ancient entity with enormous mental powers. Mizrix's first solid blow knocked Liwa to the ground. The fallen Toa responded with a mental shock blast that came close to turning Mizrix's brain to ash. But still, Mizrix had been through a lot in the past millennia. Imprisonment, torture, humiliation, and no mind power was going to be enough to stop him. He gathered Liwa up in his claw and slammed his foe against the wall once, twice, and 3 times. Meanwhile, Axon's heart wasn't in this fight. He had only recently rediscovered Brutaka and regained their old friendship. He couldn't believe they were already at each other's throats once again, and he wasn't certain Brutaka was wrong. Maybe Helrix's plans were too extreme. Perhaps duty lay in protecting the Matoran until the very last moment. But for this moment, he had to concentrate on protecting just himself, for one good hit from Brutaka would take his head clean off. Helrix, on the other hand, had not wavered in her determination, but she also knew that this battle was sure to draw Makuta Pterodax's attention. Her chance to act could disappear at any moment. She had to do the Nova Blast now, before anyone could stop her. Tuyet could guess what was about to happen. Slamming an elbow into Axon even as Brutaka struck him, she took advantage of the moment, wresting the warrior's axe from him. With a yell, she vaulted into the air and smashed Mizrix with the axe. In a roar of pain, the reptilian Makuta fell backwards right towards Helrix. Tuyet hit the ground and watched, but to her surprise, just as Mizrix was about to crush Helrix, the ancient female warrior vanished. The Makuta landed in a heap, but was barely slowed by his wound and already seeking out his attacker. And just then, in the chaos, the world began to blur in front of the combatant's eyes. At the chamber entrance, space itself appeared to be warping. The next instant, a massive figure stepped out of the distortion and stood before them. All around them, a voice both young and old echoed through the chamber, berating them for their squabbling to save existence. No one in the room had ever seen the newcomer before, but there were some who knew his voice, and all felt a chill of fear at the sound of it. Only Helrix had the presence of mind to give their visitor a name, and even she spoke it in a whisper. Artaka. Part 6. Descent into Madness. At the sight of Artaka, the chamber went silent. He stood in the shattered doorway, facing some of the most powerful beings in existence as their superior. First, his cold eyes fell on the body of Liwa. Reaching out and placing his palm on Liwa's forehead, Artaka closed his eyes. The Toa's body spasmed, then dropped to the floor. After a moment, Liwa's eyes opened and he looked around, dazed, for he had returned to his body for the first time in weeks. As Helrix began to challenge Artaka, still preparing for her Nova Blast, the combatants were frozen solid by a reverberating voice around the chamber. The voice of Makuta Pterodax, who now had drawn his attention to their gathering. Mocking their efforts to stop him, Pterodax extended the briefest of energies to the gathered beings. One instant, Axon, Brutaka, Helrix, Artaka, Mizrix, Tuyet, Hafu, Kapura, and Liwa were inside the half-ruined chamber deep beneath Metronui. The next, they were floating in the airless, icy void of outer space, slowly losing consciousness as the cold crept through their armor. On the surface of Aqua Magna, they could barely make out the dizzyingly colossal form of the great spirit robot look to the stars beyond the planet and blast off to the shattered planet of Bara Magna in search of Matadui, the mask of life, and victory over all life itself. In the void of space, Liwa summoned a thin bubble of air linked around the heads of each castaway, calling them to join hands and link up as they drifted in the cold reaches of space. Despite his efforts, not even Artaka had the power to defy a true new god, and Pterodax had blocked their return to his form. Before the warriors could make any moves, a hole appeared in space before them. Reaching outwards was a clawed hand, and before they knew it, the 9 beings found themselves sprawled on a damp stone floor. Kapura was the first to realize that the stone itself was moving, not to mention breathing. He cried out and got to his feet, backing against a wall. The bricks in the wall reached out to embrace him, holding him fast. Stepping out from the shadows was the mad half-being Vezon, who called their attention to their host. As the occupants of the chamber turned to face the being before them, they could barely make out a figure seated on the floor, chains affixed to arms and legs. The chains were writhing like serpents, and the voice of the insane, cursed great being echoed out. He had made a deal with Vezon and brought him back to this core universe, but after realizing Vezon did not have the power to free him from his prison, he tasked him to rescue some of the most powerful beings in the Matoran universe from the darkness of outer space. And so, as the cursed great being demanded his freedom, Liwa glanced out the window of his cell. He was stunned to see a forest that stretched as far as the eye could see, far larger than any jungle he had called home on the island of Matanui. For Liwa, Vezon, Artaka, Helrix, Mizrix, Axon, Brutaka, Tuyet, Kapura, and Hafu had been transported to the jungle planet of Bota Magna, moon of Spheris Magna. Meanwhile, back in the Matoran universe, on the island of Zakaz, the Toamari watched in horror as a terrifying fusion emerged from the pool of energized protodermis. A mixture of a Zyglak, a Vortex, a Steltian laborer, and the 5 surviving Baraka, It had been created by the barbaric Skakti in an elaborate ritual. And now, it was free. It was terrible, and it was beautiful. Towering 12 feet high, with gleaming golden skin, powerful muscles, and piercing green eyes, it regarded the assembled Skakti with the benevolent gaze of a creator. Only the vaguely reptilian cast of its face took away from its stunning appearance. As this new, golden-skinned being cried out in hunger, its hypnotic mental powers took hold of the assembled Skakti and Toamari, binding them in its sway. Throwing down their weapons, the 5 Toamari rose and walked forward, ready and eager to obey the commands of their new Dark Master. Back in the Southern Islands, the pterodax of the Melding universe and Komator and Mazika readied for combat against the 3 Shadow Takanuva who blocked their path. The pterodax of our core universe had expected the Melding pterodax to react nobly and fight from a distance, using his long-range abilities to hold the Takanuva at bay. But the Melding pterodax had no such weaknesses. Unlimbering his warhammer, Pterodax charged. Before the startled Shadow Toa could react, Pterodax had swung his hammer, striking one Toa in the face and shattering his mask to pieces. Whirling, he landed another hammer blow to the chest armor of a second Toa, cracking it straight down the center. Mazika moved in then, catching the third Takanuva with a scissor kick and sending him to the ground. Pterodax made sure he would never be getting up. The now maskless Toa staggered forward, firing shadow energy from his hands at random. One blast caught Pterodax in the shoulder, badly damaging his armor. Without the luxury to feel pain or worry about his escaping antidermis, Melding Pterodax created a swirling fog of darkness to conceal his movements. Using the cover to his advantage, Mazika reached out with all his senses, leaping and whirling in midair with his eyes fully blinded, sensing the scrape of Shadow Takanuva's boots on rock. His foot connected with the Toa's mask, knocking it askew but not dislodging it. Even as his momentum carried him forward, Mazika landed a second blow to the Shadow Toa's neck. Enraged, the Toa hurled tendrils of darkness that began to strangle the Matoran. But just then, there was a sickening crunch, and the Shadow Toa's face went blank. Behind him was Pterodax and his Warhammer, which had smashed Takanuva's mask and brain to pieces. The 2 warriors had finally overcome their trials, but the final battle was only about to begin. Part 7. In the Valley of the Maze. As Makuta Pterodax, in the body of the Great Spirit Robot, blasted off from Aqua Magna to challenge Matanui on Bara Magna, the Toa of Life was encountering his own trials and tribulations in the desert sands. While rebellions were fought across the Matoran universe and the Toa Nuva led their allies to victory, Matanui struggled through the Valley of the Maze, ancient fortress of the Great Beings which housed a mysterious power source deep within. Meanwhile, the Glatorian continued to defend the Agori from wandering bandits like Sama and remnants of Skrull patrols who still sought to conquer more land in the wake of Tuma's defeat. With all the warriors unaware of the impending threat of the Batera legions, Akar and Kina set off to the north of Bara Magna, seeking out Matanui to aid in his quests. At the same time, Gresh scoured the wastelands for superior armor and weapons, preparing to act as one of the few defenders of the recently constructed mega village around the prototype robot. During this time, the Agori Tarduk, still consumed with questions about the Great Beings and the mysterious Red Star, ventured back north to complete his journey to the Valley of the Maze. Managing to enter the Fortress of the Great Beings and outwit the Element Lords who sought the secrets for themselves, Tarduk was quickly tied in chains and suspended above a pool of lava by automated defense systems, which detected his foreign presence in the Fortress of the Great Beings. And after facing many of the maze's automated defenses, elemental traps, and endless riddles, Matanui finally arrived at the center of the maze, where he encountered Tarduk. Quickly freeing the Agori of Jungle, Matanui ventured deeper within the fortress, where he discovered a computer stationed within the mechanized volcano. Before his eyes, images projected on the walls around him, detailing his mission to study other cultures and civilizations throughout the galaxy, to understand the reason for war and how to prevent it from arising on Spherus Magna again. On the screen, the progress of the Great Spirit Robot was tracked, which showed how Matanui had completed his mission and was headed home just as Makuta Pterodax struck him down with a virus, causing the robot to crash towards the planet. As the impact threw him into a deep slumber and erased his memories, Matanui was surprised to see that the restoration of Spherus Magna required a second colossal robot. And so, as Matanui and Tarduk delved deeper within the maze, they encountered the ancient power source to the second robot and left the maze after seizing it for themselves. At last, Matanui was closer than ever to regaining control of a massive robotic form, and our journey is about to come to an end. Part 8. journey's end. Returning to the Mega Village with the power source, Matanui intended to use it to reawaken the prototype robot and restore Spherus Magna once and for all. Despite being confronted by Gresh and Ranu, who accused him of being willing to destroy their only shelter just to gain more power, Matanui convinced them of his noble intentions, and Ranu reluctantly allowed him to use the Mega Village, but not before warning him that should he betray the Agori, they would find a way to make him pay. The Agori and Glatorian of the four tribes then left the Mega Village, taking shelter in the mountainous caves, and Matanui prepared to enter the prototype robot. Bidding him a tearful farewell, Kina, who had grown close to Matanui over his time in Bara Magna, was the last to send him off. And so, in an explosion of energy and light, Matanui's spirit exited his body and traveled into the prototype robot, awakening it after 150,000 years. As energy rippled across the land and tendrils of glowing green light beamed from the sockets of the robot, Matanui rose once again. Barely managing to keep control over the ancient internal systems with the Mask of Life, Matanui struggled to his feet. Power surged through his body, out through his metal fingertips, and he began the cosmic process of reuniting the moons of Aqua Magna and Bota Magna with Bara Magna. As gargantuan forces of gravity rippled through space and Matanui concentrated on restoring Spherus Magna, Makuta Pterodax, in the body of the original Great Spirit robot, grew ever closer to Bara Magna. Inside the Matoran universe, Tahu and Onua had just succeeded in destroying the final supply of energized protodermis. Reconvening with Gali, Pohatu, and Kopaka, the 5 remaining Toa Nuva had little time to ponder where Liwa had gone before rushing to the southern regions of the robot, tracking hordes of Rakshi that had abandoned their posts and flooded to spaces unknown. Ordering all remaining agents of the Order of Matanui, active Toa teams, and Dark Hunters to rush to the southern islands in pursuit, Tahu watched as legions of Exotoa, Visorak, and Skakti, led by Nektan, followed the Rakshi to the southern legions. As the forces of both good and evil rushed to the south, there was impact on Bara Magna. Makuta Pterodax, commanding the most powerful weapon of destruction in existence, had just made landfall on the planet's surface. In an instant, Pterodax vaporized a peak in the Black Spike Mountains, killing several Skrull and proposed an alliance to conquer the universe together to Matanui. As Matanui refused, in response, Pterodax used his own gravity powers to tear off the mountain above the cave where most of the Agori and Glatorian were hiding, forcing them to flee onto the desert sands. In an instant, Makuta Pterodax engaged Matanui in a full-on robotic duel above the clouds. On the ground beneath Pterodax's feet, Gresh and the Glatorian concentrated their blasters at single spots on his armor, hoping to distract him long enough for Matanui to gain the upper hand. But before they had a chance to deal any damage, hatches opened by Makuta's feet, and out of the darkness poured countless legions of Rakshi, Skakti, and Visorak, followed closely by the forces of good. While the two armies clashed, Takanuva and the Toa Nuva emerged from the opening, joining forces with the Glatorian in a climactic battle. To avoid standing out and being targeted by Rakshi, Takanuva altered his armor color to silver, blending in with the Toa and Glatorian of ice as he blasted through waves of villains. In the distance, Stronius watched the proceedings and, seeking revenge for the Rock Tribe's earlier defeat, led bands of Skrull warriors into the battle, which had now begun in earnest. In a different section of Bara Magna, Tahu Nuva stumbled out of the Matoran universe, faced with the blinding light and heat of the desert. Cast into a vision of Tawahi by the Mask of Life, Tahu was shown a flashback to thousands of years ago, where the great beings had designed a set of golden armor to be worn specifically by Toa Mata Tahu in the event of an emergency. With the ability to destroy all solid antidermis in the area, the armor could act as a vast explosion of energy to decimate all Rakshi forces, which of course used armor made of solid antidermis. All around Tahu, the golden armor began to materialize, and the Mask of Life devolved him purposefully into his original Toa Mata form, as he was needed in his unaltered state to fulfill this crucial task. But before Tahu could don this golden armor and destroy the Rakshi, Pterodax noticed the blinding glow of light and sent a gargantuan blast of energy from his hands, scattering the pieces of golden armor all across Bara Magna. Meeting up with Takanuva, Tahu began a search to recollect all the pieces of the golden armor, all while other Toa fought bravely against the forces of Makuta. Introducing himself to Gresh and the Glatorian, Tahu had only moments to explain the threat before the battles resumed. The Toa Haka, now fully cleared of Pterodax's illusion, held a desperate defense alongside the Glatorian, protecting the Agori villagers. In other regions of the desert, Gali and Pohatu clashed with Skakti barbarians, decimating entire legions in their wake. And in the skies above them, Mata Nui and Makuta Pterodax engage in their climactic final battle. Pterodax dispatching Visorak spiders to rapidly seal breaches in the hull with their webs, and Mata Nui barely managing to hold off the titanic foe. As Mata Nui declared that the Agori and Platorian would never submit to Pterodax, Pterodax crushed Bara Magna with his gravitic powers. In desperation, Mata Nui shoved Pterodax and redirected the blast towards the two moons of Aqua and Bota Magna, accelerating their descent toward the planet. He then redoubled his efforts, forcing Pterodax backwards towards a falling fragment of Aqua Magna. And in the desert, Tahu encountered Nektan, the Skakti warlord who now seized a piece of the golden armor for himself. Challenging him in a one-on-one duel, Tahu sliced through his crescent scythe, melting Nektan's armor with his fire blast and utterly defeating the Skakti warlord. In the desert, Gresh, Takanuva, and the rest of the Glatorian and Agori battled Pterodax's forces for the golden armor, desperately fighting to regain and get each piece to Tahu. In a truly epic battle stretching across the planet, Tahu managed to finally regain control of the golden armor. The Toa of Fire concentrated, focusing his thoughts just as he would do to activate a mass power or control flame. But this time, he was willing the golden armor to do whatever it could to end this battle. Power surged through him. He screamed as electricity locked his muscles and suffused his body with blinding light. Tendrils of energy shot from Tahu, coiling around every Rakshi on the battlefield. In an instant, the creatures fell to the ground, seized by spasms as their power raced back along the tendrils and into Tahu. As the combatants on both sides watched, the Rakshi's armor disintegrated and the Krata slugs inside them exploded into shards of shadow. On the horizon, Tahu was still screaming as the energies of hundreds of Rakshi threatened to overwhelm him. Then, abruptly, the nimbus of power around him disappeared and he dropped like a stone. And just that quickly, the battle was over. With the Rakshi gone, the Skakti and Skrull were badly outnumbered by the Glatorian and Tahu's Toa Legion. Some surrendered, while others scattered back in the desert to fight another day. But no one was celebrating. They all knew victory meant nothing if Makuta killed Mata Nui, and it seemed there was nothing they could do to prevent that. But what none of the fighters on the ground realized was that they had already done more than they realized. Each Krata was bound to its creator in some way, and in this case, Makuta Pterodax. While he did not feel their pain, he could sense their debts. The loss of so many at once made him hesitate for just a moment. For that instant, Makuta Pterodax was paying no attention to the world around him or the sky above him. Mata Nui saw it coming. It was why he had forced Makuta to this northern edge of Bara Magna. His last gambit was about to pay off, and by a miracle, he was going to live to see it. A shadow fell over the robots, the shadow of the moon of Bota Magna returning to its place of origin. Using the last of his energy, Mata Nui rose and shoved Makuta backwards into the path of the planetoid. Its edge impacted the robot, smashing in the metallic head with a sickening crunch. Pterodax's armored form began to topple towards Mata Nui and the Bara Magna Desert, and using every last bit of mechanical muscle he possessed, Mata Nui caught Makuta and pushed him aside, causing the massive robot to fall and be impaled on the black spikes. The impact of the robot crushed the mountains to powder, even as the twin collisions of Bota Magna and Aqua Magna shook the entire world. And with that, thousands of years of anguish, of suffering, of death and darkness, all of it was gone in an instant. Mata Nui had prevailed, and Makuta Pterodax was no more. The three fragments of Spherus Magna were one once again. Destiny had been achieved, but this journey was not yet at its end. The battle was over. The Bara Magna Desert was a disaster area. The surrounding mountains had been pulverized or flattened, and massive scorch marks scarred the sand. The ground was littered with the bodies of those who had lost their lives in the clash, alongside countless shattered pieces of Rakshi armor. Dominating it all, of course, was the fallen robot that had once been Makuta Pterodax's greatest weapon. Tahu and Takanuva stood on a dune, looking at the metallic shell inside which they had lived their entire lives. No doubt the inner workings had been heavily damaged and there would be casualties. But as they watched the multitude streaming out of the robot, they saw many familiar figures. More than likely, most had taken shelter after the initial quake, and so survived the much larger shock. They stumbled out onto the sands. Toa, Matoran villagers, Vortex traders, Skakti barbarians, agents of the Order of Matanui, Dark Hunter bandits, animals, Rahi, birds, insects, and more, all shielding their eyes against the bright sun of this new planet. Towering above the clouds to the skies above, Matanui surveyed this brave new world. He watched as new species and populations mingled and met, witnessing the birth of new culture and world order before his eyes. The Matoran and Agori had much to learn from each other. The Toa team with the Glatorian would now safeguard both sets of villagers from any threat. Natural alliances were being forged even now. Matanui turned his attention then to the fallen form of Makuta. There was another alliance that should have existed, but never came to pass. Had he and Pterodax worked together, they could have restored Spherus Magna without the devastation and loss of life. But Pterodax's greed and ambition wouldn't allow that, and in the end, both his mad dreams and the body he had stolen were wreckage. Makuta was the past. It was time to worry about today and tomorrow for this world. When he had gone to Ranu and asked to take the Agori city from them, Matanui had made a vow to the Agori and himself. If he succeeded in rebuilding this planet, he would not stop there. He would give the Agori a new life, a new chance to thrive here. And now was the time to begin that work. And even though he knew that this final act of creation would doom his spirit, his mind, and his body, Matanui knew just what he had to do. Just as Matoro had sacrificed himself to save the life of Matanui, it was his own turn to pay the great debt owed to the world of Spherus Magna and its people. And so, with no fear or doubt in his heart, Matanui looked to the sky and stretched out his arms. He summoned the energies that coursed through his body, even as he called out to the Mask of Life. The mask at first resisted. It too knew that it might well not survive this, and it did not want to cease to exist. Matanui could have forced the Ignika to aid him. He truly had a stronger will, but he did not. Instead, he simply pictured in his mind how Spherus Magna could be if this was successful. He knew the mask would sense what was in his thoughts, and it would know this would be the ultimate use of its power. A moment later, Matanui felt the power of the Kanohi Ignika, Mask of Life, merge with what little remained of his own. Then, he willed that power to flow from his body and sweep across the planet. Everywhere it touched, mountains rose, forest flourished, life appeared where none had been before. In the desert of Barra Magna, time seemed to flow backwards as barren sand gave way to a jungle teeming with trees, and plants and long-dead rivers returned to life. The vast ocean of Aqua Magna felt Matanui's touch as well. Underwater, plants flourished, providing a bounty for the fish that swam in the sea. The power of the Mask of Life touched even the twisted, mutated beings who lived in the depths, curing them of the worst of their afflictions while leaving them to survive beneath the waves. In the great forest of Bota Magna, the giant biomechanical reptiles created so long ago by the great beings watched, amazed, as their homeland shifted and changed all around them. Areas where trees and foliage had ceased to grow suddenly were green again. Smaller animals emerged from their hiding places to feast on the new growth. Agori and Glatorian that stood in the once desert were speechless. This was not the world they once knew. It was better. After 100,000 years of struggling to survive, of scraping for every morsel of food and drop of water, there was now enough for all. As they watched in awe, clouds gathered above their heads for the first time in living memory. It began to rain in Barra Magna. And with this final act of creation, Matanui fell. Toppling downwards and crumpling under the strain and energy of life, both the robot and spirit of Matanui lay dormant once again. Arriving on a ridge by the collapsed form of the robot, Tahu, Akar, and Kina sat and mourned the loss of a god and friend. Agori, Matoran, and Glatorian had gathered now, drawn by the sight of the great robot's collapse. Some looked grief-stricken, others merely puzzled, and some fearful. Matanui had granted them a new life and a new world, and no doubt they expected him to lead them into the future. Instead, he was gone, and they were on their own again. Kina turned back to the pile of wreckage, damp from the gentle rain. For a moment, she thought a shaft of sunlight had forced its way through the clouds, for there was a faint glow in the center of the rubble. But then, the glow grew brighter. Akar saw it too, and climbed over the twisted metal to reach the source. He reached down and emerged with the Mask of Life, now gleaming brighter than a sun. Flaring so brightly that all present had to shield their eyes from the light, the spirit of Matanui echoed from the mask, thanking his friends and proclaiming destiny fulfilled. And so, with the last remnants of his energy, Matanui bid his friends with one final task. Seek out the great beings, tell them that the planet is whole once more, and convince them to share their gifts. For Matanui himself had learned what it meant to have friends, not subjects, workers, or soldiers, true brothers, and he hoped that the great beings may be able to do the same. And to quote Matanui, "All journeys must come to an end, but this time there is a new beginning as well. There will be challenges to face and enemies to fight, but I know you will overcome. All that has gone before, my friends, has only served to give birth to this new day. Let unity, duty, and destiny be your guides. Be well, be strong, care for this world and for each other. Farewell." And so ends the legend of the Bionicle. 10 chapters, 10 years of history, and with Chapter 10, Destiny fulfilled, there is only one tale left to tell. In 2 weeks, tune in to the epilogue of this long journey, where we find out what happened after Spherus Magna was restored, where Liwa, Artaka, and their companions journey next, what happened to the Shadow One and the Baraki, if the Toamari will ever break free from their spell, and what truly lies on the mysterious Red Star. But that's a story for another time. And with that, we have summed up this final chapter of Bionicle Retold.
Alright, and with that, we have summed up the entire Bionicle storyline from the beginning to the end, with Chapter 10, Destiny. I hope you enjoyed this truly epic journey, and as always, let me know down in the comments below what you liked, what you disliked, and if you still have any remaining questions after this episode. But don't worry, because that's not all, because in the next 2 weeks, I will be publishing the Epilogue, an extra chapter to this entire journey, which deals with some of the plot threads that were set up in the immediate aftermath of Bionicle's cancellation as a LEGO theme, where they decided to continue the story on for just a little bit. Now here's a fair warning. The ending that we just covered today is a great ending for the entire Bionicle storyline. If you don't want to be kept hanging, I'd suggest that you just stop watching here. But if you really do want to see the entire Bionicle storyline, then go ahead and tune in, for in the next 2 weeks, we'll be publishing the secret chapter, Chapter 11, the Epilogue, New Beginnings. Because here, there's a lot of stuff still left to cover. And now one final note, if you're interested in seeing where those story plot threads are going, I actually published an in-depth analysis video where myself and Bionicle scholar and 3D modeler in the community, King K, went over what might have happened should Bionicle have continued, and where those story threads started in the epilogue but unfortunately never actually completed would have gone. So definitely check out that video after watching the epilogue if you wish. And with that, I'll leave everyone for now. I'll see you again in 2 weeks when we go over the epilogue to the Biological Chronicle, Bionicle Retold. Thank you all for tuning in to Duck Bricks. I'll talk to you again very soon, and bye-bye for now.